Hey, so basically, this is a reading space, kind of like an audiobook, in which I read a chapter out of the book of Tip of the Spear by Orisanmi Burton. So we're on chapter 5, and this is Hidden War, Four Strategies of Reformist Counterinsurgency. So I'm going to go ahead and get the book pulled up. If you go on my page, you'll find the free PDF along with the previous chapters or previous readings. What I also do if you're listening from Twitter is that I make a thread of these books so that you can easily so they can easily be accessible. So today is like a mad busy day, so I'm gonna be speeding through this. So it is a recorded space. So those that are listening on Twitter, you can turn on the captions to make it easier to follow along for some people. That makes this material even more accessible. And on YouTube also has subtitles available. I'm not sure about Spotify, but we're just gonna jump right into it. Hopefully this reading isn't too fast. I am a little pressed for time, but we're just gonna do what we gotta do. So this is chapter 5. This book has a total of 6 chapters, so it's one more chapter after this, and that'll be it. And of course, we're going over what happened during the Attica uprising, as well as the state response in, then massacring those rebels. And that's also known as the Attica Massacre. So, chapter 5, Hidden War, Four Strategies of Reformist Counterinsurgency. The massacre that occurred in Attica prison on September 13th, 1971 was only the inaugural moment in a multifaceted campaign of prison pacification. The planners and administrators of this campaign strategically co opted the demands of the prison movement and redeployed them in ways that strengthened their ability to dominate people on both sides of prison walls. Through shrewdly constructed discourses of reform, they created new and improved prisons, bolstered security protocols, augmented their labor force, and legitimized their power, all while appearing to bow to radical demands. As planned, these putatively benign dispensations exploited a key contradiction within the prison movement, ultimately cleaving support from the movement's radical edge while nurturing its accommodationist tendencies. Thus, contrary to how they are popularly understood, I conceptualize the post Attica reform not as a break with the violence of the massacre, but its extension, albeit in a barely perceptible form. That paragraph hits on so many things, and we can draw so many parallels. For me, I think about how movement work is done today and a lot of people's experiences within the movement that have turned a lot of people off from even organizing or being involved in the grassroots is because this happens a lot. The way we go about any kind of issue or, violent program imposed on the people from the state, what we do is instead of going to the meat of the problem, you'll have people who will come in, swoop in, and present reformist ideas as radical and revolutionary when all they do is help the state extend its power while giving the facade and the veneer of change. And I love how he put that, and that is the same game plan that they did during the Attica uprising, and the same thing they do continuously today, regardless of what movement we're looking at. So it's up to us as people, one, to be very discerning and diligent that we don't fall for these reformist strategies or look at that as any way liberatory politics, because it is not. It only helps the state. I'll keep reading. A growing body of scholarship unearths the logics of war that undergird assumptively benevolent domestic reforms. From the education programs of the Reconstruction era to the community action programs of the Johnson administration, scholars have shown that state efforts to pacify populations to achieve peace without justice involve the calibration of violence with inducements and solicitations. These discussions typically conceptualize the prison as a manifestation of the hard, violent, and repressive side of this dynamic, and indeed it is. As I argued in the introduction, by 1970, state actors increasingly deployed carceral institutions as a means of quelling Black urban rebellion. However, this strategy generated unintended consequences. It gave rise to the Long Attica Revolt. The intensifying struggle behind the walls made clear that existing techniques of carceral domination, geographically incapacitating populations, fomenting interracial hostility, quarantining ringleaders, and naked violence were no longer sufficient to maintain order. Although these overtly repressive measures would remain central in the post-Attica context, they are augmented with a constellation of modernized, progressive, and gentle techniques, all in quotes, which sought to produce compliant and rehabilitated, also in quotes, subjects in ways that were not immediately recognized as coercive. This strategy constituted a second layer of domestic war, one that targeted restive, incarcerated populations in order to maintain power beyond the prison walls. While the primary aims of this reformist counterinsurgency were to reassert dominance over the captive population and to isolate radicals, it had auxiliary targets as well. Planners of this campaign used reform to regain legitimacy with prison guards, who had learned through the assault force's killing of their co-workers that their lives were worth little more than those of the prisoners. The reforms were also designed to solicit publics beyond the walls, a large fraction of whom had grown increasingly critical of prisons and developed sympathy, if not solidarity, with the prison movement. Thus, the post-Attica reforms marked a turning point in which prison cracks began looking beyond the prison, embarking on new efforts to project carceral power and ideology outward. Yo, that shit's heavy and I'll try to keep the commentary short. Again, I'm really pressed for time, so I'm going to try to get through this chapter quickly. But the deal is that I like how he points out the aims of reformist counterinsurgency and like why they did it. And one of the points that stuck out to me in that paragraph is that how he says that not only did the state needed to reassert its dominance with the captives, the people who had overtaken the prisons, the rebels, and they needed to bring them back to a state of being just an inmate to, dehumanize them so that they would never try to fight for their freedom again. And also to use that torture and the violence they inflicted on those rebels as a warning to others who might want to rebel, that this is what they'll face. They also had to regain the trust of the guards, because remember, when the state went in to overtake the prison back from the rebels, they killed hostages, and those hostages were the guards who had did the bidding of the state all these years, were loyal lapdogs, were willing to dehumanize captives and prisoners alike on behalf of the state and for a paycheck. They saw how expendable their life was even as an overseer. And so now the state had to, a part of its reformist strategy was to win the hearts back of those that they had basically recognized their position within the system, that you are expendable as an overseer, as a settler, landowner. White supremacy will throw you away if you threaten empire, or throw you away just as cannon fodder. That's what it does. So the state recognizing that, it's like, all right, so we need to get the prison back, the rebels back in a dehumanized state because they've tasted freedom. So that makes them dangerous. So we need to break their will. But we also, too, need to get our overseers in check and to make sure that they'll still work for us, because now they realize that we see them as also expendable. So we need to fix that. But then also, too, they needed to gain the consensus of the population outside of the prison walls back, because of the rebels revolting and basically showing bare naked the state. The people, too, also saw not only the inhumane treatment, but the possibility of freedom. Can't have that. Not in an empire. So I like how he points that out. Let me keep reading. This chapter demystifies prison reform as a modality of psychological warfare, also known as psychological operations, or PSYOPs. The U.S. Army defines this modality as, quote, the planned use of propaganda and other measures to influence the opinions, emotions, attitudes, and behavior of hostile, neutral, or friendly groups in such a way as to support the achievement of national objectives, end quote. Through the tactical deployment of propaganda and other measures, military, political, economic, social, cultural, and so on, planners of this hidden war sought to degrade the rebels' will to struggle while fostering support for their regime among neutral and friendly populations. They sought to incarcerate the horizon of their political aspirations, replace emotions and effects of rebellion with those of compliance, foster investment in prison legitimacy, and convince populations that they were not at war. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill, wrote Sun Tzu more than 2 millennia ago. I'll grab some water. Sorry, I lost my place. Let me see. Okay, detailed in this chapter is an inherent tension within the prison movement between pragmatic and ameliorative, sorry, I don't know that word, and revolutionary abolitionist demands. This tension is a crucial part of why the reformist counterinsurgency was so effective. As I will document, carceral planners exploited the tension, cynical co-opting the demands in order to marginalize more radical aspirations for social transformation. Building on this chapter will analyze 4 categories of reformist counterinsurgency: expansion, humanization, diversification, and this is going to be a hard one, programification. Oh, never mind. I did that shit. I show that key actors within the state penal hierarchy shaped how the reforms were conceptualized and implemented, arguing that while they were promoted as concessions, their true aim was far more sinister. Through these interlocking reforms, carceral planners sought to disaggregate the captive population, to distribute it across an expanding and diversifying carceral network, and to foster an environment that was less conducive to rebellion, one where new rehabilitative programs could take root and flourish with the active support from communities on both sides of prison walls. These moves had profound effects. They isolated organizers, demobilized revolutionary organizing, and stabilized the carceral system in a moment of profound crisis. By tracing the inception, implementation, and reception of these carceral innovations, I provide a framework for conceptualizing prison of today as institutionalized counterinsurgency. One of the reasons why I'm so hype about reading this chapter in particular is because, again, we can draw so many useful parallels for today and how in which they roll out their counterinsurgency plans, especially for people who are keeping an eye on things such as cop cities being built all over the United States and why that is. And the propaganda being used to manufacture consent among the people, it's meant to repress that we do this on your behalf. You need cop cities. You need to be, protected by us, even though we know that's not the purpose of a cop city, right? We understand that as we see food prices go up, people not being able to afford housing, healthcare is non-existent for most of us and inaccessible for many. And so we see what's coming. And we also see the state's response is going to be a very violent, repressive one. And at the same time, psychological warfare dictates that I have to convince you and manufacture consent that you need me to be this repressive as a state. And so we have to resist that by any means necessary. And of course, when I say that, I'm very blunt in saying cop cities should be being burnt down. Anytime they lay any kind of foundation, break that bitch up. Any machines they use to build it, tear them the fuck apart. We definitely have to not sit idly by and let them expand this network of concentration camps. I'm going to keep reading. And if I'm reading mad fast, I apologize. I'm just really short on time today. So this next section is called Unpacking the Contradiction. Although a central argument of this book is that the Long Attica Revolt articulated an revolutionary abolitionist vision that is reducible to demands for prison reform, it is also true that throughout the revolt, incarcerated people and their loved ones enunciated and struggled over pragmatic demands to violent prison conditions. The tension between the urgent need to secure reforms to enable the captives' immediate survival as human beings and the equally urgent project of abolishing broader systems of oppression is a central contradiction of the prison movement and the broader Black liberation struggle. While harm provides essential relief for those enduring it, such relief can have a stabilizing effect on the predatory systems that generate harm in the first place. At the same time, as I have shown throughout this book, those who engage in militant attacks against the system inexorably face the wrath of the state, often resulting in a painful existence and a premature death. This internal tension and its implications were on full display during the public hearing of the New York State Select Committee on Correctional Institutions and Programs. Governor Nelson Rockefeller had launched this committee in the weeks after the massacre, a shrewd political move to generate bipartisan support for his prison reform agenda. This panel of so-called experts, lawyers, political elites, and prisoncrats triangulated the security requirements of the state with careful, selected rebel demands, proposing an array of reforms to, quote unquote, modernize the prison system, even in light of the state's current serious fiscal situation. Sorry, I had to chuckle because as he brings that out about how they wanted to modernize the prison, even while the state will claim we don't have money to do so, they always find money to expand the prison complex, while people are literally sitting with no access to clean drinking water, like we're witnessing in Atlanta. And while people don't have access to houses and libraries are being closed down, and all the necessities that make this life worth living are being stripped and taken from us or made so expensive we can't access them, they make sure to fund the prison industrial complex that are meant to house those people who rebel against it. Man, this man be cooking, bruh. Among them were the construction of new prisons, especially at the minimum and medium security levels, improvements to visitation policies, medical care, and the overall institutional atmosphere. The prison system, even in light of the state's current serious fiscal situation. Oh, I'm sorry. How did I mess that up? Sorry, I lost my place. Among them, let me find it. Overall institutional atmosphere. The implementation of new rehabilitative programs and the development of classification capability for determining the types of programs and security needs of the individuals under custody. So basically what talks about is the whole prison makeover, that now they're like, okay, we're going to allow visiting hours, or we're going to give them programs in which they can get their degree, and we're going to allow them to get this. So now it's not a concentration camp like you thought it was, and like these prisoners accurately described it. It's actually a rehabilitation center to help wayward people rehabilitating, be better citizens type of shit. And that was one of the veneers in the makeover to manufacturing consent to expanding this heinous concentration camp network. On February 11th, 1972, survivors of the Auburn and Attica rebellions, as well as their family members and supporters, all of whom were organized under the banner of the Prison Solidarity Committee, traveled to downtown Manhattan to force their critiques of these proposals into the public record. Their continued defiance in the face of state power demonstrates that the Long Attica Revolt survived the massacre. However, it also revealed that the movement's ideological and tactical heterogeneity, a condition that state actors sought to exploit. The PSC's bold intervention violated the protocols of the courtroom decorum. On the heels of a lengthy testimony claiming that the Nation of Islam was not a legitimate religion, Tom Soto, who had been in Attica during the rebellion as an outside observer, interjected from the audience. At this time, I would like to state now behind me are Lawrence Killebrew, who was shot 3 times in Attica, who was marked with an X on his back, and I have on my left Shireen of the Auburn 6, who was also in Attica during the rebellion, who was gassed at one time for 17 hours, has been beaten in courtrooms while in chains and shackles and handcuffs. And we also have Cameron Gurria, the wife of a relative in Attica who was also abused and brutalized. I believe that they should be the next ones to testify. Soto's brazen introduction of people directly targeted by carceral violence ruptured the progressive facade of the Select Committee, which was set up as a result of Attica, according to internal documents, but managed to avoid referencing the rebellion or the massacre in its initial report. After a heated argument between Soto and the Select Committee's chairman, multiple scheduled speakers ceded their time, allowing the PSC to testify. While the first two speakers described the shocking forms of sexual racism they endured in Auburn and Attica, Carmen Guerrera discussed the subtle and mundane forms of abuse the system inflicted on her whole family. She explained that her husband, James Walker, also a survivor of the Auburn and Attica rebellions, should have been standing by her side, but that on multiple occasions, his expected release date had been pushed back due to infractions occurred in a connection with the rebellions. She further explained that prison-crats were heavily censoring letters between her husband and their daughter, and that because DOCS have few Spanish language translators, weeks often passed before their letters were delivered. Guerrera outlined the significant costs associated with the 8-hour bus trip from New York City to Attica and inveighed against the invasive searches she endured before and after each visit, explaining how she and her husband tried to maintain some semblance of intimacy by poking their fingers through the wire screen that separated them during visits. She was incensed by the arbitrary restrictions on the kinds of items she was allowed to leave with her husband during these visits. She can't send honey in, she explained. They are not allowed toothpaste in there, no fruit juices. How are they supposed to supplement their diet? I'm glad Orisanmi put this part in the book with Guerrera's wife, is because like going to visit people held hostage by the state behind enemy lines, the sexual violence visitors have to endure during these searches is so sick and dehumanizing in and of itself, and even the process of it. So a lot of times, like when I go to visit folks, they transfer them all the time. So not only in keeping track of what prison they are, but oftentimes these prisons are way out in the fucking boondocks. You have to drive hours upon hours to get there. Long wait times. I mean, they do any and everything possible to keep these people isolated and to discourage people from outside the walls to stay connected. So I'm glad Orisanmi is talking about that. Orenga's efforts to keep her family whole, maintain an emotional connection with her husband, and introduce items of care that might momentarily sweeten his existence, highlight the key role that outside communities, especially women, played in ensuring the survival of those inside. Speaking from her position as caretaker of the family, her testimony challenged the Select Committee's vague language on reforming the prison quote-unquote atmosphere. Instead, she called for the immediate, man, Orisanmi loves this word and I cannot pronounce it to save my black ass life. So the word, I'm gonna spell it, AMELIORATION. If you know how to say that, yo, leave a voice message in my DM so I can fucking learn. Because he has it like 50 million times in this paragraph. But it says, instead, she called for the immediate amelioration of specific material conditions and policies that circumscribe the humanity, dignity, and collective survival of targeted communities. Rebels articulated this category of demand throughout the Long Attica Revolt from the Tombs rebels who demanded, as human beings, the dignity and justice that is due to us by right of our birth, to the Auburn demand for Black Studies Program 2, the 15 practical proposals the Attica rebels authored after being told that their immediate demands were unrealistic. Although achieving quote-unquote wins among this class of demands is critical to the long-term sustainability of movements unfolding under conditions of genocide, their pragmatism rendered them vulnerable to co-optation. To co-opt, argues sociologist Robert L. Allen, is to assimilate militant leaders and militant rhetoric while subtly transforming the militants' program for social change into a program which, in essence, buttress the status quo. Oh, fucking K, Robert Allen. And I hope this is the same Robert Allen who wrote the book Black Awakening in Capitalist America, because he actually mentions a lot of times in the book examples of how movements that will be radical in nature would be co-opted by other people language watered down, demands changed, and that the demands were only concessions to give some kind of temporary solace, but then also to kind of act as a wet blanket to a fire so that it doesn't consume the system as it should. And so it actually gave space for the system to reconfigure itself, to adjust itself to the new norm, but still have the same violent intention of genocide, which again, we see all over the global South and resistance movements, but especially in the imperial core by people who are most comfortable, who refuse to give up their comfort in order to really destroy the system. As overarching logics of the reformist counterinsurgency, psychological warfare and co-optation intentionally muddled distinctions between victories and defeats. In the words of the U.S. Army's counterinsurgency field manual, real quick, so if you go in the library that I have linked on the page, I have the counterinsurgency field manual from the U.S. Army as well as the CIA one. I encourage people to read it because, again, they be laying out whole ass plans on how they'll deal with revolt and revolution, and they write it down. So I have all the PDFs, I have this PDF of the U.S. Army's counterinsurgency field manual as well as the CIA counterinsurgency field manual. And so I encourage y'all to look that up in the library and share it so other people can have access to it. Skillful counterinsurgents can deal a significant blow to an insurgency by appropriating its cause. Man, let me read that bitch again. Skillful counterinsurgents can deal a significant blow to an insurgency by appropriating its cause. Testifying directly after guerrilla, Joseph Little exposed the imperialist logic undergirding the Select Committee's proposal. Discharged from Attica's hellish walls just 10 days earlier, Little excoriated reform and rehabilitation as modes of domination and lambasted the gathering as a farce. Its so-called experts, Little noted, were regurgitating the same old bullshit that prison reformers have been spouting for over a century. Although he could produce a long dissertation on the brutalities of prison, however, he was not among the growing chorus of people demanding reforms. Everybody wants to get on the political bandwagon. Everybody is down with the penitentiary reform. Let us make the penitentiary like the Holiday Inn. I'm not for no penitentiary reform. I am for abolishing the whole concept of penitentiary reform. Long before abolition was in vogue, Little articulated an abolitionist critique, voicing principled opposition to reforms based on an understanding that they would extend the prison's life. His analysis anticipated and radicalized French theorist Michael Foucault's oft-cited observation that prison reform is a constituent element of the prison itself. Not only did Little diagnose the centrality of reform to the prison's core functioning, he asserted a demand for the abolition of reform, which is to say, the abolition of the prison itself. As dutifully captured by the court stenographer's remarkable transcript, Little's statements elicited applause from the audience. And real quick, I just want to say that adopting that understanding, even when it pertains to settler colonialism, it would help a lot of people's analysis and strategy a lot as far as direct action. Because a lot of times you'll see groups adopt revolutionary language and co-opt causes only to usher in more neoliberal reform. And again, to not only distract, but to siphon off the revolutionary energy of the people so that as they see what happens with the inevitability of adopting reforms, it leads to the same old place and it gives the system space to update, to change, and to expand, and to adopt its language and its ways so that it's not easily picked up on. All those people who gave their energy and their time to these movements become tired. And you have what we have now. People are tired by being oppressed under capitalism and white supremacy. And then when they get active, the reformists come in and kill that spirit in that way as well. It's so fucking fucked. But I'm gonna keep reading. So basically what I'm trying to say is that we have to do away with reform and we have to do away with accepting like these easy concessions and see it as an attempt of an empire to prolong its lifespan. And we should see that as a time to pounce. So Yeah, they'll say like, okay, so these people over here are protesting, and what do they want? Clean water. Well, how about we give them some kind of program in STEM or some bullshit, right? Like, I'll use a good example that actually happened to me. No, you know what? I don't have that much time. My bad, y'all. But basically, I think y'all get the crux of what he's saying. He states it well, so I think the word stands on its own. So I'm gonna keep the commentary to a minimum so I can get out of here. Little then denounced rehabilitation as propaganda, a disguised attempt to pacify the inmates, make them docile citizens, train them to be like robots, and mold them according to white ruling class values. I am to be rehabilitated to be like who? To be like the racist guards, the racist administrators who are running this country? To be like Rockefeller or the Mellons or other ruling class? Am I to be like you gentlemen sitting there? Just what constitutes rehabilitation? He asked. There is nothing wrong with me. What needs to be rehabilitated is the society we live in. This interrogational critique, inverted standard criminological analytics, which trace criminality to biological, physiological, or cultural defects believed to be internal to those who transgress the law. To the contrary, Little contended that the structure of society is defective, that social life is afflicted by capitalism and white supremacy. In his view, if the committee were truly interested in eliminating violence and crime, they would attack these systems of power, for they produce what Little called a dog eat dog society, a society that requires crime and prisons. In a 1973 address to the Fraternal Order of Police, Democratic Congressman Richard H. Ickford described an ongoing investigation by the House Internal Security Committee, of which he was a chairman, in the following way. Our committee has also been conducting a wide-ranging inquiry into the exploitation of prison conditions and unrest by revolutionary groups and organizations in an effort to recruit from behind prison walls and with the aim of tearing down the administration of the penal system as a prelude to destroying the institutions and form of our entire government. Little's unapologetically abolitionist demand for the overturning of the political economic structure of society is more compatible with the often dismissed theory than it is with liberal reformist analytics that focus on prisoners' rights. As I have already shown, many of the revolt's combatants, engineers, and elected spokesmen saw themselves as a tip of a revolutionary spear and engaged in anti-carceral insurgency with capacious ambitions in mind. Recognizing the implication of Little's testimony, the vice chairman of the select committee asked Little if his political analysis was shared by others. When the problems at Attica arose, were the people at the proper front of that particular movement fighting for the things that you mentioned before in your testimony? The complete change and not interested in the superficial change that perhaps might have been recommended in a report like this, he asked. Little neither confirmed nor denied the revolt's revolutionary impulse. Although he and a few others were now outside the prison walls, they remained targets of carceral state repression. Jury selection in the long-delayed trial of 6 men criminally charged for their role in the Auburn Rebellion had just commenced, and the state's criminal investigation of the Attica rebels was developing rapidly. Moreover, in one of his last public statements before his sudden death, J. Edgar Hoover raised the specter of an unholy alliance between Black hardened criminal prison inmates and Black revolutionary extremists. With the help of HISC, Hoover's secret program to neutralize these imprisoned revolutionaries would soon evolve into the prison activist surveillance program. It would have been reckless for Little to elaborate on the revolutionary underpinnings of the Attica Rebellion within this context of intensifying repression. It seems as though you might be trying to bait me into admitting that I am advocating the overthrow of the government or something like that. But I am no fool, he replied. Little knew state actors were looking for any excuse to further criminalize and pathologize the rebels. which made it tactically necessary for him to de-emphasize Attica's revolutionary politics. Such concealment and obfuscation are central to the conduct of revolutionary warfare. Unfortunately, most scholars and analysts have overlooked this point, taking its outward focus on formal demands at face value. In doing so, they have unwittingly reinforced the reformist counterinsurgency project. Okay, come on, man. Sorry, I have so much shit I want to talk, but I don't have that much time today, so I'm gonna just keep reading. But man, I hope y'all go and revisit his book, because every time I reread it, it just awakens something new in me. I love this writing. But I do want to say how important it is in anyone's revolutionary praxis to understand that you must connect with those behind enemy lines and understand their role in this entire global struggle of liberation against white supremacy. I'll keep reading. The approaches represented by Guerrilla and Little are not necessarily antagonistic. Rather, they exist in productive tension within the PSC, and especially abolitionist formation launched by quote-unquote free world organizers in support of the Auburn rebels. The same tension existed within individual organizers as well. Throughout the 1960s, Martin Sostre and others launched several successful lawsuits that legally compelled prison authorities to ameliorate dehumanizing conditions, and yet these conditions endured. In The New Prisoner, an Arabic essay published in 1973, Sostre asserts that Auburn and Attica represented decades of painful exhaustion of all peaceful means of obtaining redress, of the impossibility of obtaining justice within the legal framework of an oppressive racist society, which was founded on the most heinous injustices: murder, robbery, slavery. For Sostre, the fact that what he called the Attica reform demands were aimed at many of the conditions that his successful litigation should have already resolved demonstrated that captives had no choice but to rebel, seize hostages, and adopt a more revolutionary posture. Sostre saw value in reform and abolition demands, particularly when they were grounded in a revolutionary critique of the social order. Here's a quote. As the insurgent campaign develops, a split is likely to open between the organizers and their followers. And the more successful the campaign, the wider will be the split, because the greater the number of concessions granted by the government, the less have the participants to gain from seeing it overthrown, writes counterinsurgency specialist Frank Kitson. So real quick, because I might have messed up the way I delivered that. So basically what he's saying is that the more concessions people get, the harder it is to overthrow the system, because now they don't see a need to. They're like, well, look, if we just, compromise with them, if we just meet them at the table, if we just, debate them in the marketplace of ideas, like these crackers love to say, they'll give us what we want. And that's an illusion to, again, stop the fight and to preserve the system and allow it to keep expanding. And what we've seen and what we lived through is that anytime we get concessions, they take it right back. And so we end up in this continued loop of begging for what we should have already had. And then they take it, and then our descendants beg for the same thing again. And unfortunately, we see that as progress. We're really just spinning in place on a hamster wheel. So I'll keep reading. In what follows, I show how carceral planners followed Kitson's playbook, co-opting demands in order to exacerbate the split within prison movements. As the keynote speaker for the 1971 National Conference on Corrections, U.S. Attorney General John N. Mitchell laid out the general approach in the prison context. Although the Attica Rebellion was perhaps the largest and most dynamic prison rebellion to date, congressional researchers had identified at least 17 other rebellions in 1971 alone. Like Rockefeller, Hoover, and Eckerd, Mitchell believed these eruptions were the work of a militant hardcore among the inmates. To his audience of prison cracks from across the United States, he explained, if you change the conditions under which the greater majority of them function, You won't have these problems on the massive scale that you have had in a couple of these institutions. Changing the conditions involved four strategies of hidden war: expansion, humanization, diversification, and programification. This next section is called expansion. While no individual is singularly responsible for directing the reformist counterinsurgency, Governor Rockefeller was among its key architects. Although rarely described as such, this heir to the Standard Oil dynasty was a seasoned administrator of hidden warfare. He and his brother, David, a former U.S. Army intelligence officer in Algeria and president of Chase Manhattan Bank, were mentored by John and Allen Dulles, who, as the respective heads of the State Department and the CIA during the 1950s, shaped U.S. foreign policy during the height of the Cold War. I keep saying I'm not going to interrupt, but y'all be hearing this shit? Like, that's why people say struggles are connected, and why it's so important for us to create open source documents tracing everyone who is involved in the prison industrial complex, everyone who is involved in funding genocides across the global south. Like, put the names, addresses, companies, so we can link them. And that is when we can create a strategy. We're really going to war with these motherfuckers, like real talk. So I love that he does that. Prior to becoming the chief executive of the empire, Rockefeller used his post as president of the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, to fight what Francis Stono Saunders calls the Cultural Cold War. In collaboration with the CIA, MoMA elevated abstract expressionism, an artistic movement favored by Cold War strategists because it allegedly promoted anti-communist values like free enterprise and American exceptionalism. There's this movie about Jackson Pollock, and I wish I could remember exactly what it's named, but it lays this out about how the CIA like backed and other classes backed like elevating this type of art for this specific reason. And it's so wild. But yeah, I'll find the title of the movie, and then I'll make a post so that people can watch it. An artistic movement favored by Cold War strategists because it allegedly promoted anti-communist values like free enterprise and American exceptionalism. Rockefeller also headed the office of the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, a massive intelligence gathering and propaganda disseminating operation in Latin America, and chaired the planning coordinating group, which used psychological and political warfare techniques to destabilize communist governments. His use of this technique was consistent with the formative role played by the Rockefeller Foundation in developing the science of propaganda in service of U.S. empire during World War II. Rockefeller's Cold War outlook informed his approach to the Long Attica Revolt and shaped his understanding of Black rebellion as a threat to Western civilization. If y'all don't eat that shit up, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, let me stop. Because see, I get excited and I start going on my fucking tangents. I'm going to keep reading. But I really love this book. He maintained that Attica was caused by the revolutionary tactics of militants. And while testifying about Attica, drew an explicit connection between methods employed by Black revolutionaries in the United States and those in Latin America. Here's a quote. One of the most recent and widely used techniques of modern day revolutionaries has been the taking of political hostages and using the threat to kill them as blackmail to achieve unconditional demands and to gain wide public attention to further their revolutionary ends. By suggesting that U.S. prisons were beset with the same political forces that were destabilizing Western imperialism abroad, Rockefeller implicitly justified the massacre and offered a rationale for ongoing counterinsurgency measures. Stressing the existential nature of the threat, he told members of his inner circle, there was more at stake in Attica even than saving lives. There was the whole rule of law to consider, the whole fabric of our society, in fact. Real quick, because it makes me think of how, as people fight for better working conditions within the belly of the beast in settler colonies, we oftentimes don't, a lot of us on a mass scale like we need to, don't connect the dots on what that means and how that plays out in the reverberating effects within the global south. So as we protest our conditions here in the workplace, as we should, as we should. What ends up happening, though, the concession, the reform, is that they outsourced the slavery and the horrid conditions to places in the global south that they had already destabilized and therefore can take advantage of the people. So then the sweatshops then get moved to the global south. You know, the mines and the way in which they can exploit the people in other countries that Western imperialism has destabilized, that they now can outsource those conditions which we call dehumanizing here. And they are. Well, now the people in the global south are being exploited in that way. And that happens a lot. So the reason why I bring that up is because I love how Orisanmi, writes this chapter to highlight how Rockefeller saying, yo, these prisoners standing up, these prisoners who are exploited for their labor, creating whole slave economies that are keeping cities afloat. Like really, there's a lot of cities that would not exist without a prison labor force to exploit. That's sick shit. Making millionaires into billionaires because of the free labor. Them stepping up and revolting against this dehumanization, and of course, all the other violence that they were, had to sustain. So fucking sick. They also, they understand, the imperialists understand, and the settlers understand how it's connected to a larger struggle. So when we talk about the slave mines in the Congo and the other sweatshops like in Haiti and all this other gross shit that, is an inevitability of capitalism, we understand that burning down the prisons, freeing the captives held by the state has a huge effect, like I said, a reverberating effect across the global south. And that's why we have to connect struggles. So it's free Haiti and it's free people within the prisons. It's free Palestine and it's burn down the prisons. It's free the Congo and it's burn down the prisons. It's never one or just one and wait your turn. It's everything at once. All of it's connected. And that must always be on the forefront of our consciousness, especially if we want to see revolution in our lifetime. I keep telling y'all I'm not going to interrupt, and then I go on these tangents. I apologize. Let me keep reading. Explorations of Rockefeller's role in forging the carceral state have largely focused on the so-called Rockefeller drug laws. Ratified in 1973, they restricted plea bargaining opportunities and imposed mandatory minimums, sentences for a range of drug offenses. As the 1970s and 1980s wore on and racial criminalization became a key mode of governance, similar laws were replicated throughout the nation, increasing prison populations by prolonging sentence lengths. This intensification of what Nixon, after consulting with Rockefeller, had termed the war on drugs, is an important aspect of how the United States became the world's foremost jailer. However, in lieu of rehashing this well-worn historical ground, I focus on how Black prison rebellion was also a key driver of prison expansion and how prison expansion fits into a broader framework of counterinsurgency as hidden war. Expansion is I don't know what this phrase is, so I'm going to spell it out. Sinequa. So I'm going to mispronounce it. So sin qua, none of prison reform, insofar as reforms rarely, if ever, entail a diminution of the state's capacity to capture and punish targeted populations. When Attica erupted on September 9, 1971, New York State managed a population of 12,500 incarcerated peoples distributed across 12 major prisons. Auburn, the oldest structure in its network, had opened more than a century and a half earlier, while Green Haven, the newest, opened in 1949. In the decades after the massacre, the state embarked upon a rapacious experiment with the criminalization and incarceration of targeted populations, namely economically dispossessed Black and Latinx communities, women of color, queer and trans people, and undocumented immigrants. By the year 2000, the peak of its physical carceral capacity, New York boasted 71 prisons and a captive population of more than 71,000. The youth of this punitive infrastructure mirrored similar developments nationwide. The total U.S. state and federal captive population exploded by 500% between 1971 and 2010. As I will show, Attica was a pivotal moment that gave rise to the unprecedented expansion. published in 1970, the American Correctional Association's Anti-Riot Manual provides the basis for understanding prison expansion, modernization, and proliferation as a psychological warfare. Antiquated facilities, which are large, drab, overcrowded, and isolated from the community, are conducive to the development of frustration and anger. They wrote, while small, well-designed institutions with individual cells are more effective in reducing disturbances and tensions within the institution. Prison expansion, they claimed, reduced overcrowding. This, of course, is a pernicious myth, given that expanded capacity seems almost inevitably to become inadequate soon after it is made available. Less crowded prisons were said to relieve tension, frustration, and anger, thereby preventing spontaneous rebellions from emerging, while planned disturbances could be neutralized by removing and isolating intelligent and revolutionary individuals from the general population, a move requiring flexible carceral capacity. So real quick, I want to just talk about Qasim Jarreau, who I've talked about a few times in these recordings. So I haven't heard from him since the last recording. So I want to say it's been about maybe 5 days. Forgive me because I lose track of time easily. But yeah, I haven't heard from him in a while. And the reason why, of course, that's always worrying, is because if you understand the conditions in which these people are forced to live under, you will understand like what they're going through and what it means when we can't hear or reach them. So I have a post where it's a link to where you can put money on his books if you're in position to, or even write letters. It is really important to write letters. And again, this is not the end goal, but this is what we do in the meantime as we strategize for burning this shit down, is that we have to remind people who are behind enemy lines that they are not disconnected from us, that we remember them, that we hold space for them, and that they are still our family. And we're going to fight to get them free within our lifetime. So if you go on my page and if you type in Qasim, I believe, or if you look at the other spaces of the chapters and the replies, you'll see the information to write to him and to put money on his books. And the reason why it reminded me of him is because this man, in other spaces, I played his recordings, but I also have a letter from him today. Very intelligent, very revolutionary minded. While he was in prison, he was radicalized and he adopted the politics of New Africans and understood his position as a New African within the belly of the beast, and writes about it all the time. And his writings are amazing. And again, his analysis is spot on. So every Black August, he's kept in solitary confinement for those reasons. And just a reminder, this book will go out to over 50 people held captive by the state. And so this will be like an anchoring force for them, I hope. And to also let them know that, no, this isn't in your head. This is literal war, and they are torturing you. And the only way that we can end this is, one, by setting you free, but then two, also to burning down the prison and the state that makes it possible for prisons to exist in the first place. But I'll keep reading. Citing the ACA document, the Select Committee's second report noted that one of the most desirable and effective methods available is for the system to have a multiplicity of facilities for the difficult agitators. Having alternate facilities provides a means for the inmate to reestablish himself and remove his negative influence in regards to the original peer group. That's in quotes. And of course, basically what they're saying is we need to expand the prison industrial complex to prevent overcrowding, which we know that's not the truth, because many of these private prisons have contracts with the cities and the state that they're in, that if they're not at 90+% capacity, that they can actually sue the state for not giving them human bodies to fill up their fucking prisons. Ain't that some sick shit? And we know that the real tool of expanding the prison industrial complex, and one of the many tools or the reasons for this tool, is because people like Qasim, who are very aware of their role within the revolutionary struggle globally, get moved around a lot, so that any kind of cadres that they build, any kind of political consciousness that they raise can be disrupted by removing them over and over and over again. If it's easier to wrap your mind around, for me, I think of it like gentrification, how Black people are constantly being displaced, have to constantly move either in search of jobs or because the housing is too expensive, they have to go find elsewhere that they can afford. What ends up happening is that that's disrupting communities. Any ties that you have Any kind of history you have been struggling forward together, creating networks, that gets disrupted by gentrification, which is why people say that this is an act of neocolonialism. But I keep lying to y'all and say I won't interrupt. So let me let me try to stick to it. State actors have been aware of their need for more prisons since the beginning of the revolt. Readers may recall that in the wake of the jail rebellion, the state system was forced to absorb 3,000 captives who have been under the city's control. This shift transformed the composition of the prisons, resulting in Auburn having what one administrator called a critical mass of revolutionaries. Given that these revolutionaries were blamed for the ensuing rebellion in Auburn, it is unsurprising that one of the key ideas guiding the 1973 multi-year master plan, which laid out the system's capital requirements through 1978, was the need to avoid critical masses in all facilities. Smaller, more manageable numbers in the living, eating, working, and recreational areas will decrease the risk of widespread disturbances, while the prospect of a more humane scale are increased, the plan stated. By creating new infrastructure to more effectively isolate revolutionaries, while cultivating an emotional state that was conducive to order, prison expansion was indispensable to counterinsurgency. So again, as we see cop cities being erected all over the country, we should see that as an act of counterinsurgency to suppress rebellion. The whole propaganda around we're helping crime, we're keeping y'all safe, reject that at all costs. Because it's literally at our expense if we accept that narrative, because that is not what's happening. They are just expanding and continuing an ongoing protracted war. This counterinsurgent rationale for expansion has remained central to carceral state development across decades. As a law enforcement union representative told the state legislature in 1985, without expansion, the entire system is at risk. Without expansion, there is increased tensions between inmates. Without expansion, more inmates who should be classified as being in maximum facilities will be in medium, and so on down the line. Without expansion, the discipline system breaks down, as we have inadequate numbers of special housing units. As discipline breaks down, so does our control of the system. As you are aware, when control of the system is compromised, the potential for a riot or other disturbances are markedly increased. I'm sorry, I have to say this, because so that was a quote I read, basically them explaining like, look,